thank you so much, Martin and Peter and all the organizers. We are both law professors, so a 15-minute clock is a challenge, but it's one that we will try to meet. EPCOT, we all know, started life as a futuristic city. It was Walt Disney's experimental prototype community of tomorrow, but it became a theme park. The 1982 version of that theme park had a thesis statement that progress would be achieved through technology developed by large American institutions like the sponsors of Future World's pavilions, operating in the absence of scarcity for both profit and for public benefit. That theory of innovation has been replaced by one that centers individuals, that celebrates entrepreneurship, and that focuses on risk capital. And modern EPCOT, we think, reflects those changing sensibilities. Because the Disney parks are sites of collective understanding, we argue in this paper that the evolution of EPCOT provides a lens through which to understand the neoliberal shift in innovation theory from the 1980s through the 2010s. It's a reflection both of changing legal and economic circumstances and of the stories that we tell ourselves about how our society pursues innovation and progress.
Hey, thanks. And I'll just reiterate Mike's thanks as well. This is my first time here, and I just want to say thank you for having me and also for everybody being so welcoming. It's also great to see, put some names with faces of folks whose work I've admired from afar. So I won't spend too much time on history that I bet we all in this room know reasonably well. As Mike said, EPCOT began life as an idea for a kind of prototype community, then eventually transitions to becoming a theme park after a series of various ideas in the 1970s, including settling on the front half of the theme park being Future World. Of course, Future World draws on a long tradition of Disneyland and then other themed ideas, including, which probably reached its apotheosis in the World's Fair in New York 1964, and what many Imagineers referred to as refrigerator shows. That is, attractions that would both provide great entertainment value, but would also serve as advertisements for their corporate sponsors. And perhaps the most prominent of these was the Carousel of Progress, which of course was actually designed in part to sell General Electric refrigerators. And so the idea here is not just as a set of ads, but also the theme in the Carousel of Progress very much suggests a kind of theory of capitalism and a kind of post-war liberal consensus ideal that progress would be brought to you by large corporations, and particularly vertically integrated corporations that also may have been part of monopolies, or regulated oligopolies. This idea carries forward to the first iteration of Future World, which was essentially a set of Carousel of Progress style refrigerator shows. The history and future of communications, sponsored by the Bell System, energy sponsored by Exxon, transportation and General Motors, agriculture and nutrition brought to you by Kraft Foods, imagination brought to you by Eastern Kodak, and then what ultimately became the update of the Carousel of Progress in EPCOT Center, Horizons, also sponsored by General Electric. EPCOT also itself had this sense of scale to it, monumental architectural structures that mirror the monumental nature of the corporations that were as prominent enough in American life and also able to have the financial resources to sponsor these various massive attractions. And indeed, perhaps one of the best examples of this is the one that you encounter when you first enter the park, Spaceship Earth, which was originally brought to you not by AT&T, but by the Bell System. And indeed, the Bell System is quite different from the AT&T that we know today. But Spaceship Earth in its original formulation was the quintessential refrigerator show, the history of communications naturalized to a present brought to you by the Bell System, and indeed a hopeful future brought to you by technology developed by the Bell System. Now, this was an actual model of innovation. Indeed, AT&T's monopoly not only over telephone communications, but also the equipment for telephone communications, whether industrial or the very phones that hung on your wall, were all part of an integrated, vertically integrated monopoly. And indeed, part of this monopoly was Bell Laboratories. And Bell Laboratories was justified, was a justification for the monopoly that the government protected for AT&T. The idea that AT&T needed this monopoly in order to be able to have a laboratory that could do basic science, that would bring a series of innovations that would benefit the culture at large. So the transistor, information theory, Telstar, the first photovoltaic solar panel, all inventions of Bell Laboratories, not necessarily with any immediate application to telephone communications. And in a sense, this is the model of innovation, I think, that was really exemplified in the original EPCOT Center pavilions. Now, by the time EPCOT opens, however, in 1982, this is already starting to become a kind of out-of-date theory of capitalism and economic progress. Indeed, by the time you get to the early 1980s, the arguments against various sporadic government efforts to break up the Bell system's monopoly start to become far more successful. And indeed, by the time you get to the early 1980s and the dawn of the Reagan administration, the breakup of the Bell system actually is accomplished through a settlement with the Department of Justice. And this is part and parcel of the Reagan administration's theory of capitalism, brought to you not by regulated monopolies, but by deregulation that leads to more competition and more innovation, not by large institutions, but through market competition. And so it's also a clue as to what a law professor is doing here. I happen to do a fair bit of work on antitrust law and deregulation. And the notion that this kind of deregulatory moment happens virtually immediately after EPCOT opens coincides with the almost immediate change in sponsorship for Spaceship Earth from the Bell system to what was the far scaled down corporation that had been divested of much of its parts, AT&T. And this is not only exemplary of the Reagan administration's deregulatory philosophy, but also a broader philosophy of innovation and capitalism that emerges in the 1980s.
Yeah, so the deregulatory moment of the 1980s, over the next 30 years, results in a set of sort of shifting norms and assumptions about how innovation gets done. And it's a shifting set of norms and assumptions that we call sort of neoliberal innovation. Neoliberalism is a disputed term. It means a lot of things to a lot of people. But in this context, what we are talking about is, the idea that Americans could put their trust in large public institutions with their best interests crumbled. Right? This is part of a larger story of neoliberal governance that includes, relevant to these purposes, a move to shareholder primacy in corporate law and culture. But as reflected in sort of the way that we move from the GEs and Kodaks and Krafts of the world to the Googles and Facebooks and A16Zs of the world, is to understand that the future belonged not just to large institutions, but instead to brilliant individuals. It would be funded not from corporate profits invested over a relatively long time horizon, but from risk capital that demanded a 10x return over the 7 years roughly from funding to exit. That it required not incremental change at the level of basic science, but sort of big swings and disruption. That's a move from sort of collectively focused innovation to more individually focused innovation. And that move is also reflected in the changing aspects of EPCOT. So as EPCOT moved from EPCOT Center of the 1980s to the EPCOT that we know today, it lost the coherence of its early years, focused less on collectivism and more on something more individualistic. And you can see this in a few aspects of modern EPCOT. So for instance, the very renaming of Future World to the more anodyne World Celebration, World Nature, World Discovery, that represents, not the collective future in which we would all live, but instead more individual spaces where one can discover and one can be in nature. Similarly, the replacement of, for instance, the Fountain of Nations, right? That was a sort of collectivist enterprise with spaces for individual seating where folks go to be alone. And most importantly, changing the focus of the attractions that moved from edutainment to escapism and fun. And note too the absence of modern sponsors. There are no sort of Apples or Facebooks or Googles sponsoring EPCOT attractions. Instead, these are based on sort of individual conceptions of what the individual wants to do to live out their own fantasy. And so we ultimately conclude from this sort of short story that these are narrative spaces that help us to crystallize and clarify what might otherwise be, hidden or difficult to discern. And the story of EPCOT Center in particular highlights the breakdown of the 20th century consensus about innovation and modern EPCOT's struggle to tell a coherent story about 21st century innovation. And that struggle, we think, reflects the nature of this new innovation model that's shifted away from a sort of shared conception of the public good and therefore is more difficult to instantiate in a theme park narrative. So we want to stop here. We've got a few minutes left, and we're eager to hear your thoughts and questions. Yeah, we'll just call. Go ahead. Over here. Yes, you. Thanks. Sorry, I'm gonna point.
You talk about how originally EPCOT went from the collective to the individual, and are now struggling with telling a cohesive collective story. Is there? Oh. Do I need to repeat?
No, we heard you.
I guess what, in your opinion, would be the next step of that? If we went from one big group collective of this is the potential future for everybody, now this is the potential next step forward for you as an individual, is the next step smaller groups? Is it moving more towards the big collective again? Are we going through waves?
So I think, if you buy our central thesis that EPCOT is, a reflection in part of changing mores, then I guess the larger question is, what's the next sort of innovation model? So increasingly, Silicon Valley style innovation is not celebrated the way it was in the mid-2010s, but I don't think we really know what comes next. And so I think that also reflects the sort of uncertain moment in which EPCOT currently finds itself.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also don't know the next step of EPCOT, because it seems to me that the infrastructure of EPCOT is somewhat inconsistent with the world in which we find ourselves now. Even a concept like World Showcase feels somewhat out of date in a world where the connections that we draw with one another are often through interests, the internet, and various subcultures, and not necessarily dominated by monolithic.
Up front and center, you were supposed to go through the old world and then look across and see the shining new world. Mm-hmm. I just thought I'd bring that up because John Hench was a friend of ours, and he was never liked that.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's it's interesting to think about what would have been if the narrative structure of old to new stayed in place, right? Because that's sort of a different story, a different narrative than here is sort of, your pavilions of progress